Hello, I'm Arnav Verma from the University of Toronto, and I'm excited to present our work designing resource allocation tools to promote fair allocation, trying to understand do visualization and information framing matter on behalf of my collaborators, Luis Maurice, Pierre Drekovich, and Fanny Chevalier. There are many tragedies that happen around the world which can leave entire communities devastated. In the past 10 years, over 10,000 people needed to evacuate in the Algerian wildfires. 33 million people were affected in the Pakistani floods. 85,000 were affected by the flood in the Central African Republic, and 6.8 million people have been displaced due to socioeconomic crises in Venezuela. All need support to sustain themselves, but resources such as money are limited. Between these causes, how do we allocate the resources available in a fair manner? Well, there exist tools to help people make donations, but most focus on promoting donating more to a chosen cause, but they do not support how to donate fairly between different causes. Now imagine charitable programs that target groups of people that are very similar, have similar needs, and only differ by the number of people in the group. And you are responsible for allocating $1 million. What could prevent you from splitting fairly? There are several biases that can influence you. You may be subject to what's called compassion fade, a decrease in feeling compelled to help when the number of people needing help increases. This could cause you to not give to enough people in the larger group. Or you may be subject to what's called the drop in the bucket effect, a feeling that helping only a few people accomplishes next to nothing. This could cause you to not give to enough people in the smaller group. So how can we design a tool to promote fair allocations among groups of different sizes? Well, studies have shown that using visualizations to show individuals behind the data can influence how we think. However, the way information is presented can also cause bias. This is called the framing effect. That is, small changes in presentation, like in this example here, can potentially influence your opinion. Here, seeing the people as individuals or as two separate groups. To understand the promise of visualizations, we investigate whether visualization, in addition to text, makes a difference to allocation behavior when compared to only the text. And to understand if framing influences our task, we check whether presenting resource allocation information on a per group basis, which shows only the amount allocated to each group, improves fairness when compared to doing so on a per individual basis, which shows the resource allocated to each individual. Here, 500 per person represented at the stack of coins for each individual. To study these effects, we created a story for two charitable programs, Alpha with 3 children, Zephyr with 12 children, and we give participants hypothetical money to allocate between two groups. To make allocations, participants use a web interface. You can see the slider moves between two programs. Moving to the right shifts the money to Zephyr, and moving to the left shifts the money to program Alpha. We break down how each person allocates the given resources into 5 categories. If participants keep the money evenly split between groups, like at the start, we say it's a naive allocation. If we move to evenly split between individuals, regardless of the group, we call that a fair allocation. Anything in between those two would be a mixed allocation. Going past the fair allocation would mean that you favor the individuals in the larger group. Conversely, going to the left of the naive distribution would mean that you favor the smaller group. So with that, let's get into experiment 1, where we do an initial investigation of resource allocation using the responses of 239 participants. We have 4 conditions along the 2 variables described earlier: presentation format, which has text only and text and visualization, and framing, with a per group framing and a per individual framing. We randomly assigned participants to one of 4 conditions. The chart shows the distribution of responses categorized based on the allocation strategies which I explained earlier. We found that participants mostly allocated fairly. However, those with the group framing allocated slightly less fairly. This chart shows the mean allocations to the Zephyr group, with 2,400 corresponding to a perfectly fair allocation. Overall, people are quite fair, but tend not to allocate enough to individuals in the larger group. Taking a closer look at the difference of means between the two presentation formats, we don't find evidence for a difference. This is the case for both framings. However, in the presence of visualization, group framing seems to have contributed lower allocations towards Zephyr. So overall, we found some evidence for group framing contributing to lower allocations towards the larger group, which was Zephyr. Thus, in experiment 2, we wanted to take a closer look at fair versus unfair allocations using the responses of 244 participants. Since some participants commented that they were uncertain about the assumptions, we added some explicit instructions for clarity. We noted that all money you donate to a program will be split evenly between the children in the program, and that children from both programs are in a very similar situation and need the money equally. They will not benefit from any other donation than yours. Here is the breakdown of responses. This time, there were similar allocations across conditions. For the aggregated measure, this time we looked at the percentage of participants who made a perfectly fair allocation, with some indication that individual framing may yield more fair allocations. Let's take a look at the pairwise differences between the conditions. We didn't find an effect of presentation format on the proportion of fair allocations, but we did find weak evidence that individual framing might have yielded slightly more fair allocations than the group framing, both for both presentation formats. We have some evidence for individual framing contributing to fair allocations. To investigate framing further, in experiment 3, we took a more systematic look at the presentation format and framing with 495 participants. We have 8 conditions defined by visualization framing, that is no visualization, group framing, and individual framing. And same for text. Text can be absent, frame per group, or frame per individual. We assigned participants randomly to one of these conditions. We wanted to increase the difference between the two groups, so we kept the smaller program the same and increased Zephyr to 120 people. And participants were asked to allocate $24,000, keeping fair allocation at $200 per person. To fit this new information, we redesigned the interface and icon. The result in this experiment was much different than the previous study. Notice that a majority of the participants in most conditions did not allocate resources perfectly fairly. We created a new measure, which is the distance to a perfectly fair allocation. Allocating 24,000 to Zephyr was now perfectly fair and therefore had a distance of 0, while all other amounts had the distance of the absolute difference between that amount and 24,000. See how across conditions, the mean difference was consistently off by around 2,000 from a perfectly fair allocation. We performed statistical contrast to understand the relationship between text framing and visualization framing. We only report the main results here though. Contrasting visualization framing, we found that when text was framed per group, people were less unfair when the visualization present was framed per individual. This was the case even when the group frame text was by itself. We find that we may be able to potentially curb unfair allocations that may be caused by group text framing effects, specifically through individual framed visualizations. So, what can we take away from these findings? Well, in general, more fair allocations occur when visualizations are presented with an individual framing, regardless of the accompanying text. A key limitation of our study is that it uses a highly idealized resource allocation scenario with a range of assumptions that are unlikely to be met in real life. We need studies to look at complex scenarios like charity programs that are not equally effective or populations that are heterogeneous in their demographics. So looking at current tools, we recommend practitioners to add visualizations to resource allocation tools. This can help people consume information and allocate resources to charities more equitably. Thank you for attending our talk, and please find the interactive demos and materials on our website.